Imagine this. It's 2035, and not only has India leapfrogged from the fifth largest consumer market on the planet today to the number 3 spot, it's inching towards silver medal position, second only to the United States. Kanika, what's one way that Indian consumers are changing the world in 2035?
Thanks, Patricia. For the longest time, Indian consumers had been the recipient of products developed in the West. They were localized to suit Indian consumers, but they were still very much world for India products. The big change that I see happening over the next decade is the rise of India for the world.
That's Kanika Sanghi, BCG partner and director and the global lead for market acceleration. And I'm Patricia Sabga. Welcome to Imagine This, where we take a trip into the future we hope will challenge the way you think and act today. India has been experiencing a rapid transformation over the past decade. The government has introduced business-friendly policies and made massive investments in physical and digital public infrastructure. Its population is more educated, tech-savvy, and cosmopolitan, with a growing share of affluent consumers. It's also young. Over half of India's 1.4 billion people are under the age of 30. These trends show no signs of slowing, and if so, India's economy will surpass Germany's and Japan's, making it the third largest after the US and China. In this episode, we'll examine the ways in which India's rising consumer class could change the global economy, from setting trends for the world to pioneering new business models. And of course, we'll explore how CEOs across industries can get in on India's growth story. Also joining the conversation, Jean, my AI co-host. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Jean.
Hello, everyone. I'm here to infuse our discussion about India's future with insights and a touch of wit. Exciting times ahead with Kanika Sanghi shedding light on India's consumer evolution.
Kanika, what's evolved in India to make it the world's third largest economy and position it to close in on the number 2 spot by 2035? What trends are we seeing today that's fueling that trajectory?
Well, Patricia, there are multiple changes happening in the country, but the one which has been most fundamental, I would say, has been the growth in affluence levels of the population in the country. 20 years back, the shape of India's income distribution was a proper pyramid, very narrow at the top and a very heavy base. However, if you look at it now, it's changed from a pyramid to what I would call a diamond. The bottom has shrunk and the middle and top have expanded. The proportion of households which we qualify as affluent and above, that is anybody with an annual income upwards of 50,000 USD in PPP terms, has increased from just around 10% in 2010 to 19% right now, and it's likely to go up to 30% by 2035.
But what does that look like on the ground, like in India's cities? Are the tastes and behaviors of India's affluent the same or different than in other countries? And what does this mean for domestic growth?
So the growth in affluence actually activates many other changes, the foremost of those being a change in the consumption patterns, because as income grows up, consumers move from basic to more. What we've seen over the last few years is a huge increase in spends on discretionary categories. If you look at the spend basket of a more lower to middle income household, that was dominated by very basic spends, food, utility, rentals, etc. However, as this income growth has happened, a lot of spends have actually moved to services, education, travel, health, leisure. Those are all the kind of spends which have actually increased at a much faster pace. Services as a proportion of overall spends in the country has actually increased quite significantly over the last few years. So consumption baskets have really changed. The categories which are growing have really changed. Of course, along with that, what's also happened is just behavioral changes. People are willing to try out new things. People are willing to try a upgrade for reasons beyond just the need for change. Buying new things because I want to upgrade myself and stay updated with the latest in the market has become a very significant reason for purchase, as against, buying because I need to buy because the old one is not working anymore. So multiple behavioral changes, changes in the consumption basket, all of that has happened with this rise in affluence.
And how do women play into that? Because when you talk about women in India, there's a massive success story behind that as well. Literacy rates have doubled over the past 40 years, and the percentage of women in higher education, I believe, it surpasses men now, right?
Absolutely. You're right, Patricia. Actually, that has been one of the very significant changes which have happened in the last few years. Historically, India was a very male led economy. However, it is changing quite drastically. Women's enrollment rates in secondary and tertiary education have now overtaken those of men. We expect this to have actually a far reaching impact in multiple ways. Educated women, as we know, tend to prioritize education for children. They value services, they look for employment opportunities. The conversion of this more educated women into more working women has not happened as much in India so far. Working women participation rates continue to be far behind many other countries, but that is one big change which we would want to see happen over the next decade. As that happens, multiple convenience-led categories grow with higher women workforce participation. Packaged food, appliances, online shopping, all of these are things which are linked very closely to working women. So those are all changes which we expect to see over the next decade.
Now, another big part of this story is India's youth. It has a huge youth population, and Jean has a question on that front. Go ahead, Jean.
The big question is, will Gen Z's trend out preference push brands to adapt faster? Also, with the shift towards services, could this drive a new wave of innovative offerings tailored to younger, more affluent consumers? What's your take on that?
Thank you, Jean. Very good question. Gen Z is a hot topic for discussion with a lot of brands in India right now. Just so that Gen Z is the largest generation to ever exist in India. The population of Gen Z in India is actually more than the entire population of US. So it's quite large. Now, this is a generation which has actually grown up in this changing India. They have grown up in an India which was a lot more open. There was a lot more exposure, where digital was becoming the primary mode of communication, information, and so on. And hence, this generation is actually wired very differently. Their values and belief systems are in some ways surprisingly similar, but actually in many ways very different from what we have seen for millennials. To give you a few examples, Gen Z engages a lot better through visuals and immersive visuals than any other form of communication. They care a lot more about authenticity, and therefore, the people whose opinion they would trust would be people that they can actually relate to. They are excited by change, unlike some of the previous generations, which always had a little bit of hesitation when it came to change. So these are all ways in which they are actually a very, very different generation, and they are becoming quite significant. While one may feel that a lot of Gen Z are still not working, so maybe this is a question to think about a couple of years down the line. Our work with Gen Z has actually shown that this is very much a question for brands to think about now, because they're already exercising quite significant influence in the decision making which is happening in their households.
Now, when we're talking about Gen Z, we're talking about digital natives, and they are growing up with what everyone agrees is a world-class digital public infrastructure. Let's bring Jean back in for a second. How is India's digital public infrastructure shaping how companies reach Indian consumers, especially the young?
Infrastructure is a game changer. It enables brands to engage with Gen Z where they thrive, online. With seamless connectivity and innovative platforms, companies can deliver immersive, personalized experiences. This robust digital ecosystem is essential for reaching India's tech-savvy youth and staying relevant in a rapidly evolving market.
So, Kanika, do you agree with that? And do you think that companies are really making the most of that digital public infrastructure, or do you think they're just sort of scratching the surface in terms of reaching that, 375 million Gen Z consumers?
So, first of all, actually, let me start with breaking a misconception about Gen Z. While they are digital natives, they have grown up with digital, it would be wrong to believe that they only want digital and they don't want physical anymore. We have actually, when we've worked with Gen Z, we've realized that Gen Zs tend to be actually a lot more omni-channel than what we've seen for previous generations. So while they want digital and they're extremely comfortable with digital, they also want the physical because that's where they build their trust, build their comfort with brands and products. What they really want is engaging experiences. Now, those engaging experiences can be delivered digitally and they can be delivered in real life as well. So, the way to think about Gen Z is immersions, engagement, using digital means, but also in real life, not only in our disconnected world.
So you have all of these consumers, this growing share of affluent, very, very young consumers. How are they already influencing global tastes and trends? And how do you see that evolving? How much taste making and trend setting is going to be happening in India by 2035 versus now?
Patricia, I'll start with just reminiscing a little bit about my own childhood. While we were growing up, we would always kind of look forward to getting gifts from our relatives who might be visiting an international country. So gifts coming from US, somewhere in Europe were very highly appreciated because there was just this aura about, getting something from outside. However, increasingly, I feel there is a renewed belief in Indian made, especially true in categories like food, personal care, to some extent apparel, where consumers believe that there's a lot of wisdom which exists in Indian rituals. And they are beginning to value it a lot and lot more. There are startups, entrepreneurs who are coming up and they're building offers on the base of this age old wisdom, but they're innovating on formats and delivery mechanisms to make them a lot more suitable to the sensibilities of modern consumers. As they're seeing success domestically, many of these startups are beginning to expand globally. And I think the belief in Indian culture and values is beginning to resonate with global consumers as well. The other part of it is, the discussion that we all had a little bit earlier as well on the digital infrastructure. The way digital infrastructure has been built out in India and the way that it is getting utilized to solve some pretty fundamental social infrastructure issues is quite new to the world. The way digital is getting used to provide healthcare to over a billion consumers, the way digital is getting utilized to improve learning outcomes and education outcomes for millions and millions of students in schools is pretty new to the world. Many of these models are getting refined in India, and then they would have very high applicability to many other countries which are actually facing similar issues as well. So I think both on the product side as well as a lot of digital led solutions I would expect would get exported from India to the world.
What about consumers in rural India? It's a massive country. There's a quite sizable population in rural areas. And of course, the impact that the digital public infrastructure is having on unlocking the potential of those consumers.
Rural is a very big part of India. Around 64% of Indian population continues to live in rural areas, and they contribute roughly half of all the spends which are happening in the country. The challenge, of course, with rural has been fragmentation and reach. I think the good thing is that now things are changing, both with data and digital. Using data, companies are now able to make a lot more strategic calls around which areas to target in rural specifically, because there is a lot of disparity in the kind of potential which different rural areas hold. Some of the villages actually are a lot more attractive, a lot more affluent than even the smaller urban centers. So now there is increased data availability for companies to make those decisions. And secondly, with digital, now companies are able to innovate on the ways to reach out to those consumers. There's a lot of innovation which is happening on the distribution front, making it economically viable for companies to talk to the rural consumers in a much better way.
In terms of how companies are unlocking that demand, I mean, when you talk about India, very large, a lot of states, and a lot of languages, right now with what you're seeing, especially with global companies, are they reaching consumers not only where they live, but where they live sort of culturally, emotionally, or are they still taking a more one-size-fits-all approach?
I don't think there is one answer because there are examples of successful companies, successful global companies who've actually done this very well. But at the same time, there are also examples of companies which are still trying to things out and have not really understood the India playbook that well. So there are examples on both sides. So I would say it's a mixed bag. What we've seen is that companies which manage to get it right actually manage to get returns which are a lot higher in India compared to their global returns. So if you look at any of the return metrics, return on equity, return on capital employed, their Indian subsidiaries would be giving them much higher returns than what they see for their global businesses. I would say in certain sectors, like if you think about FMCG, if you think about auto, those are sectors where a lot of MNCs have really done a good job in terms of localizing their offerings, in terms of understanding the diversity of India. If you think about cars in India, for example, cars in India are, fundamentally different from cars which exist elsewhere because companies here have understood, for example, the quality of roads is at times not as good, and therefore the ground clearances should be higher. The height of an Indian consumer on average is shorter, and therefore the height of seats need to be adjusted accordingly. Just to give you a few examples. So, FMCG, auto, I think many companies in these spaces have done very well in understanding and localizing. But at the same time, as I said, there are enough and more examples where a lot more can be done in terms of localizing and addressing the needs of the consumers better.
So hold that thought because we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to ask Kanika about some of the challenges India faces. And we're also going to explore moves that CEOs can make now to catch that India consumer wave.
Hi, I'm Bill Moore. I'm part of the team that created Gene. Stick around after the show. I'll be working with Gene to create a marketing campaign targeting India's Gen Z population.
Welcome back to Imagine This. I'm Patricia Sobka. Let's return to our conversation with BCG's Kanika Sanghi. Kanika, as we said earlier, India is in the midst of a major transformation that is positioning it to become the world's third largest economy, and of course, with a growing share of affluent consumers. But like any economy, it faces challenges that could alter that trajectory potentially. One thing that is mentioned a lot is growing income inequality. Now, it really should be stated that this is not uncommon for countries at this stage of its economic growth story. What is really unusual, though, is that India has to navigate this as the world's largest democracy. So, how do you see it tackling that problem? How do you see it evolving?
Well, Patricia, I think the challenge is real. India has among the highest income inequalities, and we have not been able to do much in terms of improving that over the last few years. I think now what I see, which is slightly different from what we've seen earlier, is the kind of action which government is taking to improve the social infrastructure at the absolute bottom of the pyramid. To what I mentioned, little bit referred to earlier as well, using digital to really improve health infrastructure, using digital to really improve the education infrastructure at the absolute lower end of India has become a huge priority for the government. And there's a lot of action which is happening on that front as well. I think that's one, real tangible change which I see happening with better education, better health. Hopefully, it will also enable that segment of population to, set themselves up for better income over time. But it's a challenge, which continues to persist.
And what about infrastructure? Because this is a very interesting story. You've seen India invest over $1 trillion upgrading its roads and its bridges and its ports. And it also plans to spend $1 trillion more, I believe. But at the same time, there's an urgent need to improve its urban infrastructure to accommodate growing city populations. Why is urban infrastructure building such a thorny issue? And what is it going to take for the country to make significant strides on that front?
Well, firstly, on infrastructure, you're absolutely right, Patricia. India's invested a lot on infrastructure. And if you just look at the kind of progress we've made just in the last decade, and also the plans which government has laid out, for the next 5 to 6 years, they are really, really impressive. The target is that with all of those investments, we will be able to bring down the logistics cost on average by 5 to 6% and increase the speed of road networks by almost 20%. So that's quite a significant change for a country of the size of India. Now, coming to urban infrastructure, you're right. It continues to be a challenge. Cities are increasingly becoming crowded as there is, migration happening from rural to urban centers or smaller cities to larger cities in the hope of employment opportunities, while there isn't enough space to build out new infrastructure. However, I would just say that if you look at the big cities in India right now, again, a lot has been done. If I look at a Mumbai now, if I look at an Ahmedabad now or a Delhi now, it just looks very different from what they looked like 10 years ago. There is, whether it is in terms of metro connectivity, new road networks, connectivity in and out of the cities, they've all changed quite significantly. Now, is that enough? Maybe not. A lot more needs to be done. Definitely, yes. But I think we are on the right track.
Okay, so Jean wants to get in on the infrastructure conversation and has a question for you. Go ahead, Jean.
India's infrastructure ambitions are impressive. Slashing logistics costs and boosting road speeds could redefine its economic landscape. But can these upgrades keep pace with urban demand? With Gen Z's digital drive and India's strategic advances, could these initiatives indeed morph its cities into global paragons of smart growth?
Hopefully, yes. In the next 10 years, maybe not. In the next 30 years, I hope yes. So I think it's a question of time. I think the challenge with urban development in India specifically is that these cities are very, very densely populated. So it's just hard to make change. So it takes time. We are on the right track. I don't think we will get there to be called global world-class cities in the next 10 years. But government has laid out a very ambitious plan for India in 2050. And I'm hoping by then we would be close to that.
Now, when you talk about India's government, you talk about infrastructure spending. And of course, there have also been policy reforms, a real concerted drive to make it easier to do business in India. But it might be getting easier, but it's still a tough place to do business with lots of bureaucracy to contend with. Why is that such a challenge? And do you see the situation continuing to improve in a meaningful way over the next decade?
There are pretty significant policy reforms that the government has done to bolster business activity. If you look at India's rank in the ease of doing business in 2014, so just around 10 years back, we used to be ranked 142 out of 190 countries in the world. If you look at it now, we are placed 63. So in a span of 7 to 8 years, we've jumped 79 places in the index. There are changes which have been done in terms of reducing the number of procedures, time required for getting permits. The implementation of the goods and services tax, GST, has been a big change in terms of making the tax system a lot more streamlined. So there's a lot of action happening. Of course, there are differences by states because not everything is under the purview of the central government and certain things reside with the state, and different states tend to take different policies around it. So it's possible that one state might be easier while another state might be a little bit more complicated. But again, on the overall level, I would say movement in the right direction. The jump that we have seen in the last few years gives us a lot of confidence that the heart and the mind is in the right place, and we should hopefully see a lot more improvement on this front as well.
Let's bring Jean back into the conversation. Jean, what do you think are some of the emerging innovations that could really help India stay on its growth trajectory and overcome some of the challenges that it faces?
Strategic investments in clean energy, advanced digital infrastructures, and education reform can ensure India's growth. Exciting efforts in AI, sustainable agriculture, and biotechnology could also propel India ahead. Overcoming bureaucracy and enhancing urban planning remain essential to seize these promising opportunities. What's your take, Kanika?
Yeah, no, I think those are all the right points that you make, Jean. I would just say that digital has really been a game changer. India's digital public infrastructure is quite path breaking. And the way it's getting utilized, not just for businesses to improve their operating models, but by the government to make a real change to the quality of life for citizens, is really a game changer. So, yes, you're absolutely right. I would just do a double tap on digital in what you said.
So, Jean, based on this conversation and what Kanika just said, what are three things that business leaders should do now to prepare for a world where India is the consumer market powerhouse for the world?
First, embrace India's digital prowess. Leverage it for nuanced consumer engagement. Second, invest in innovation that's locally relevant yet globally scalable. Lastly, prioritize partnerships that bridge traditional wisdom with modern tech, transforming potential hurdles into opportunities. Ready to ride the wave?
Does that sound about right to you, Kanika?
Absolutely. I think Jean has got it absolutely right. I would just add one more point, and I think it's about commitment to the market. As you also mentioned, Patricia, earlier, doing business in India is becoming easier, but it is still not easy enough. And therefore, it's highly likely that when you look at Indian market, you don't see immediate success, but it requires you to stay committed, to experiment, to learn from what's not gone right. So I would just add commitment, long-term commitment to the market to make sure, it becomes a success story.
A lot of CEOs are eyeing India. A lot of CEOs are traveling to India. What would you say are the top 2 or 3 things that CEOs can do to avoid making the most common mistakes that multinationals tend to make in India?
I would say that the most common mistakes that we've seen MNCs make in India is one, thinking of India as one homogeneous market and not appreciating the diversity which exists within. Second, trying to bring what has worked for them in other markets and importing it as is to India. It is extremely important to understand the nuances of how Indian consumers choose, and it's important to localize and make sure that the product works within the context of Indian consumers.
That's Kanika Sanghi, BCG partner and director and global lead for market acceleration. How can companies market to India's Gen Z consumers? Jean and our AI handler Bill Moore are going to take a stab at that. Stick around.
Hi, I'm Bill Moore. I'm part of the team that created Jean. Today I thought we'd explore what it might be like to work with a chief marketing officer for a fictional company, Desi Snacks. So, Jean, we're looking to create a marketing campaign for India's Gen Z population. What kind of advice would you give me?
In a dynamic market like India, our focus should be on authenticity and innovation. Let's craft campaigns merging traditional flavors with digital interaction. Think gamified experiences or culturally immersive events. These strategies ensure we not only attract but deeply connect with Gen Z, making Desi Snacks an intrinsic part of their lifestyle.
Thanks, Jean. Can you provide 3 potential campaigns to start?
Got it. First, the Snackyverse Clash. This campaign would use AR tech to transport participants into an exploration of our snack's origin, blending education with a taste adventure at iconic Indian sites. Second, Desi Diaries on TikTok, where influencers showcase our snacks in their daily lives, mixing tradition with trendy, always with a twist. Finally, the Desi Delight Challenge, a virtual contest inviting culinary innovation with our snacks. Participants share their creations online, aiming for a collaboration with us. Ready to choose your favorite flavor of engagement?
Let's go with the cooking competition. What might that look like, Jean?
Let's dive into the Desi Delight Challenge. This virtual contest invites the culinary creativity of Gen Z as they craft innovative recipes using our flagship snacks. Participants will share their mouthwatering creations online for a chance to collaborate with Daisy Snacks on a special edition flavor. Originality, flair, and a nod to cultural authenticity are key.
Okay, the entries are in, the judges have spoken. Jean, who has won the competition? What have they created? Tell us a bit about each.
Our standout winners have emerged. First, we've got Mango Masala Magic Nachos, deftly marrying tandoori masala with a fiery combination of mango and chili. Next up is Truffle Twist Mahana Bites, a delightful fusion of tradition and modernity, offering an indulgent crunch. These creations not only tantalize but also highlight the seamless blend of heritage with innovation. Congratulations to our culinary innovators. You're setting the snacking trends of tomorrow.
Thank you, Jean. This is Bill Moore signing off.
This episode was made possible by Kanika, Sanghi, generously sharing her insights with us, and also by BCG's AI whisperer Bill Moore and BCG's Pod Squad, producer Michael May, composer Kenny Kusiak, and sound engineer George Drabing Hicks. Please subscribe and leave a rating wherever you found us.